I can't stop thinking about how she flat out says there are only two genders. There.
So?
It's just like, boom, right out of the gate.
Yeah, Dr. Debra Soh really does not pull her punches in this text. And, you kind of have to understand her background to get why she's being so blunt.
Right, because she used to be an academic sex researcher.
Exactly. She was fully embedded in the academic system, doing actual sex research, but she left to become a journalist because, well, according to her, she felt the political climate had just shifted so much that scientific truth was being suppressed if it didn't perfectly fit this specific progressive narrative.
Wow. And her core claim, like the absolute bedrock of her whole argument here, is that biological sex and gender are strictly binary. Like no spectrum, no fluidity. She argues they are dictated entirely by biology, not society.
Right. And she starts by taking the phrase sex assigned at birth and completely throwing it out the window.
Just totally trashes it.
Yeah. She says that phrase is scientifically misleading because sex isn't, assigned by a doctor just making a subjective guess based on a baby's appearance. She argues that biological sex across all species is determined exclusively by one specific mechanism, and that is gametes.
Gametes, as in reproductive cells.
Right, mature reproductive cells. The entire biological definition of sex just comes down to the size of those cells. So males produce small, highly mobile gametes, sperm, and females produce large, energy-dense gametes, which are eggs. And she points out that in human biology, there are absolutely no intermediate types of gametes.
And none, like zero biological middle ground at all.
Zero. According to her, it is a hard binary. It's not about your chromosomes. It's not about testosterone levels. It's not even about what genitals you have. From an evolutionary biology standpoint, it all anchors to whether your body's architecture is organized to support the production of large gametes or small gametes.
Okay, but I have to push back here, because what about intersex individuals? I mean, that's always the immediate counter-argument you hear. Doesn't the very existence of intersex conditions biologically prove that sex is actually a spectrum?
Yeah, it's the most common argument against the binary. But Soh counters it by looking at the specific math and the biology of intersex conditions. First, she notes that true intersex conditions affect less than 1% of the population.
Okay.
But her more important point is about function. She points out that even within that tiny, tiny percentage, individuals typically only produce one type of gamete.
Oh, I see. So even if someone has mixed anatomy, they aren't producing both eggs and sperm.
Exactly. The text points out that even in the absolute rarest cases where someone might have both ovarian and testicular tissue, usually only one type is functional, if any are at all. And she uses this really fascinating analogy.
What is it?
She argues that just because some people are born with 9 fingers or 11 fingers, which, happens, that doesn't force us to reconceptualize humans as anything other than a 10-fingered species.
Oh, well. So she's saying a statistical anomaly in human development doesn't just rewrite the blueprint for the entire species.
Precisely. Her argument is that a developmental variation that is just incredibly rare shouldn't redefine the fundamental biological categories for the other 99% of the population.
Okay, so if we accept her premise that physical sex is strictly binary based on gametes, what about the brain? Is a female brain fundamentally different just because the body is wired to make eggs? Because I've been told my whole life that while sex might be physical, gender-like how we act, our interests is a social construct.
And Sella argues that the social construct theory is entirely false. She makes the case that gender expression is absolutely driven by biology, and the main mechanism she points to is prenatal testosterone exposure.
Wait, prenatal, like before you're even born.
Exactly. The text details how, around 7 weeks in utero, if an embryo has a Y chromosome, the testes develop and they begin secreting this massive wave of testosterone. And this testosterone literally washes over the developing brain. It actively masculinizes the neural structure. If the embryo is female, that testosterone wash just doesn't happen.
Okay, but what does masculinizing the brain actually mean in physical terms? Are we talking about different sizes or different wiring or what?
Both, really. So Hess explains that this exposure alters the programming of neural stem cells. It triggers cell growth in certain areas and cell death in others. It's almost like a chemical wash developing a photograph. It brings out a specific image.
Right.
She cites distinct structural differences, like the amygdala, which processes threats and emotions, or a tiny region called the INAH3, which regulates sexual behavior. Both of those are consistently physically larger in men.
But hold on. If these structural differences are so clear, why did I see headlines a few years ago saying male and female brains are exactly the same? There's this huge study, I think they called it the Mosaic brain.
Yes. She spends a lot of time on the Mosaic brain study because it perfectly illustrates her problem with modern science reporting. The media absolutely loved that study. It claimed that every brain is just a random patchwork of mosaic of male and female traits, so brain sex essentially doesn't exist.
So how does she refute that? Was the data faked?
Not faked, but mathematically flawed, according to the researchers who debunked it. So P points out that the original study looked at single brain features in total isolation. But what you probably didn't hear about were the 4 subsequent academic studies that completely dismantled it.
Wait, 4?
Yeah. One research team reanalyzed the exact same MRI data, but instead of looking at features one by one, they used a multivariate analysis, meaning they looked at how all the features work together in a pattern.
Like looking at a whole face instead of just a pile of noses and eyes.
That is a perfect analogy. And when they looked at the whole pattern, they found they could correctly identify the biological sex of a given brain with up to 77% accuracy. But so Muzo notes that the media practically ignored those corrections because the mosaic theory fit the social progress narrative and the corrections threatened it.
Okay, but even with structural differences, surely socialization matters. I mean, parents are literally painting nurseries pink and blue, forcing boys to play with trucks and girls to play with dolls. That external pressure has to shape how kids express gender.
Well, Soem acknowledges that socialization plays some role in how comfortable we feel expressing ourselves, but she insists it cannot override biology. She actually shares this hilarious anecdote about colleagues who tried gender-neutral parenting.
Oh, no.
Yeah, they were determined to socialize gender out of their kids, so they gave their boy dolls and they gave their girl fire trucks.
Let me guess, it backfired.
Spectacularly, the parents literally caught the kids sneaking into each other's rooms in the middle of the night to swap the toys. The boy wanted the trucks and the girl wanted the dolls.
That is amazing.
So Comeres uses this to argue that no matter how hard parents try to socially engineer interests, that prenatal biological programming usually wins out.
Okay, but what are the real-world stakes of this? If men and women have slightly different toy preferences as kids, who cares? Does she think this actually translates to the adult world?
She does, and she points to the James Damore Google memo as the ultimate collision between this biology and modern ideology. Damore was a software engineer at Google who wrote an internal memo citing this exact prenatal testosterone science.
Right, I remember that. He was trying to explain the gender gap in tech.
Yes, and he used population-level statistics to suggest that because of these biological differences, men, on average, lean toward thing-oriented or systemizing jobs like coding, while women, on average, lean toward people-oriented jobs.
Right.
He wasn't saying women can't be engineers. He was saying biology might explain why there isn't a perfect 50-50 split, rather than just blaming the gap entirely on systemic sexism.
And people completely lost their minds. I remember the backlash being massive.
It was absolute hysteria. So Kuhn argues that from a strict scientific perspective, Damore's memo was entirely accurate. But he was fired, he was smeared globally as a misogynist, and journalists literally stripped his citations to peer-reviewed science out of their articles. So Kuhn argues this was society deciding that a biological truth was just too offensive to be allowed in the workplace.
So if gender has these deep, hardwired, binary roots like she claims, how does she explain what's happening right now? We're seeing a massive explosion of new gender labels. Non-binary, gender fluid, agender. If it's all prenatal biology, where's this coming from, especially among millennials and Gen Z?
Kuhn relies on polling data to unpack this. The text references a Harris poll showing that 10% of millennials identify as LGBTQ+, and it's heavily driven by these new gender-expansive labels. Her argument is that society is basically experiencing a massive conflation of personality with gender.
Meaning what? That they're just confusing their mood with their biology?
Basically, yes. She argues people are adopting these labels to escape rigid, traditional stereotypes rather than experiencing clinical gender dysphoria. Like, if a young girl is a tomboy, she's assertive, or she hates wearing dresses, instead of society just saying, great, you're a masculine woman, society is increasingly telling her, you must not be a woman at all, you must be non-binary or a trans man.
So they're taking variations in personality and turning them into entirely new gender categories.
Exactly. And Stokio points out a massive historical irony here. If you look back at the gay rights movement, activists spent decades and millions of dollars in research proving that sexual orientation is innate, the whole born this way narrative. And they had the hard science to back it up.
Right, like that fraternal birth order effect. But how does that actually work? I've heard of it, but what is the mechanism?
It's fascinating. The data shows that men with older biological brothers are statistically more likely to be gay, and the biological mechanism is a maternal immune response.
Wait, immune response?
Yeah. When a mother carries a male fetus, her immune system recognizes certain male-specific proteins on the Y chromosome as foreign bodies.
Like a virus.
Essentially, yes. So her body builds antibodies against them. By the time she has her third or fourth son, those antibodies are strong enough to cross the placenta and slightly alter the brain structures of the developing fetus, specifically the structures related to sexual orientation.
That is wild.
Right. Add that to Simon LeVay's famous neuroscience studies showing physical differences in the hypothalamus between gay and straight men, and you have rock-solid proof that being gay is a biological reality, not a choice.
Wow. Okay, so how does that conflict with the new gender labels?
Well, Samanto argues that the modern fluidity movement is pushing the exact opposite narrative. By arguing that gender and sexuality are flexible, fluid, and on a spectrum of choice, she says activists are actively undermining the very biological evidence that protected gay rights in the first place.
But wait, what about cultures that have had third genders for centuries, like the Phosphine in Samoa or the Muxes in Mexico? Don't they prove that gender fluidity isn't just a modern TikTok trend, but a global historical reality?
It's a great question, but Soa categorizes them completely differently based on biology. She explains that these third gender cultures aren't actually violations of the biological binary. In these specific cultures, the individuals are biologically male, they are highly feminine in their expression, and they are sexually attracted to men.
So if they lived in New York or London?
According to Soh, in Western culture, they would simply be considered feminine gay men. The label is a cultural difference, but the underlying biology, the prenatal hormonal influence, is exactly the same. So she argues it doesn't prove the existence of infinite genders, it just proves that different cultures have different social categories for gay men.
Okay, let's move from theory to where this is actually playing out in the real world right now. Because the most intense, high-stakes battleground for this nature versus nurture debate isn't at tech companies. It's happening in pediatric clinics with kids.
Yes. And this is where Soh brings in what might be the heaviest, most consequential data point in the entire text. It's about childhood gender dysphoria. She cites 11 different long-term peer-reviewed studies that have been conducted over decades.
Okay.
And across all 11 of these studies, the data shows that between 60% to 90% of children with gender dysphoria desist by puberty.
Desist meaning they just stop feeling dysphoric. They become comfortable in their biological bodies.
Yes. The dysphoria naturally resolves on its own once they go through natural puberty, and here is the crucial mechanism. Soh notes that the vast majority of these kids who desist simply grow up to be gay adults.
Wait.
Yeah, so a feminine boy who insists he is a girl at age 6 will usually just realize he's a gay male when the puberty hormones hit.
Holy shit, wait. Let me actually process what her argument means here. If her data is correct, and up to 90% of these kids would naturally grow up to be gay adults. But instead, under the current medical model, doctors are immediately validating them, putting them on puberty blockers, and moving them toward transition. Is she saying that society is essentially practicing a woke, repackaged form of gay conversion therapy?
That is exactly the terrifying conclusion Soh arrives at. She argues that instead of letting these children naturally develop into healthy gay or lesbian adults, the medical system is literally transitioning the gay out of them.
That is fucking insane.
According to her, doctors are so afraid of suicide statistics, which she argues are deeply misinterpreted, that they're rushing to medicalize kids who really just need time to grow up.
And she talks about this new wave of teenagers too, right? Rapid onset gender dysphoria, or ROGD.
Yes, ROGD is a relatively new phenomenon. Historically, gender dysphoria primarily affected young boys. But suddenly, clinics are seeing massive spikes in teenage girls with absolutely no prior history of childhood dysphoria suddenly announcing they are transgender. And Solis points out the mechanism here is social contagion.
Like it spreads.
It happens in clusters among friend groups or after heavy immersion in online communities.
So instead of looking at underlying issues like, I don't know, autism, trauma, or just the absolute misery of going through female puberty, she's saying doctors are just rubber stamping them for hormones.
That is her critique of the affirmative care model, and she argues we already have historical proof that trying to socially engineer a child's gender ends in disaster. She brings up the incredibly tragic case of David Reimer.
Oh, the John Money case.
Right. David was a biological boy born in the 1960s who suffered a botched circumcision as an infant. His parents went to Dr. John Money, who is a massive proponent of the idea that gender is purely a social construct. Since David had a twin brother, Money saw the perfect experiment. He told the parents to castrate David, give him estrogen, and raise him as a girl named Brenda.
Because Money believed that if you treat a kid like a girl, they'll just become a girl, regardless of their biology.
Exactly. And Money published papers for years parading this as a massive scientific success. But according to Soh, it was a total lie. David's brain had already been masculinized in utero. No amount of pink dresses or estrogen could change his internal biological reality. He was miserable. He eventually found out the truth and transitioned back to living as a man. But the trauma was just too much. He ended up taking his own life.
Oh, that's awful.
So Soh uses the Reimer case to argue that gender is fundamentally innate. You cannot mold it with surgery or socialization.
Okay, but if Soh has all this data, if there are decades of desistant studies, clear neurobiological MRI scans, and historical tragedies like the Reimer case proving the dangers of ignoring biology, why am I only hearing this from a researcher who had to quit her job? Why isn't this mainstream medical knowledge?
Because of the massive chilling effect on academia, Soh paints a really dark picture of modern science. She argues that the entire field of sexology has been hijacked by social justice ideology. If a researcher discovers or publishes data that contradicts the progressive blank slate narrative, they aren't just debated, they are systematically mobbed, investigated, defunded, or fired.
It's like the scientific method is being put on trial for heresy. If the data doesn't fit the religion, you burn the scientist.
That's exactly how Soh describes it. Look at the casualties she lists. Dr. Lisa Littman published a peer-reviewed paper identifying that rapid onset gender dysphoria phenomenon we talked about. Because activists didn't like the implication that being trans could be a social contagion, they protested. And Brown University literally pulled her press release while the journal subjected the paper to an unprecedented post-publication review just to appease the mob.
She also mentioned a math professor, right? Theodore Hill.
Yes. Hill wrote a purely mathematical paper modeling the greater male variability hypothesis, the idea that male traits have wider bell curves, leading to more extremes at both the high and low ends. The math was totally sound, but because the model offended people's political sensibilities, the paper was accepted and then retracted from 2 different journals. But the example that really shows the danger here is Michael Bailey.
Remind me, what did Bailey study?
Bailey is a researcher at Northwestern who wrote a book discussing a well-documented psychological concept called autogenophilia.
Right, I remember this. This is the phenomenon where a biological male is sexually aroused by the image or idea of himself as a woman.
Exactly. It's a recognized mechanism and typology for a specific, later-in-life subset of transgender women. But because that scientific reality directly contradicts the socially pleasing activist narrative that all trans women are simply women trapped in men's bodies, the backlash against Bailey was apocalyptic.
And they didn't just disagree with his data, right? Like, this is the part that is just fucking insane to me. They went after his actual life.
They tried to completely destroy him. Activists falsely accused him of sexual abuse. They filed fake ethics complaints to his university. They accused him of being an alcoholic. They even pulled photos of his children and posted them online with sexually explicit, degrading captions. All because he wrote a book about a peer-reviewed sexual typology.
That is fucking insane. That is literal terrorism against a scientist for doing his job.
It is. A medical historian named Alice Dreger actually did a multi-year investigation and proved that all the allegations against Bailey were entirely fabricated by activists. But Soh points out that the truth didn't matter because the damage to the scientific field was already done.
Right.
The message was sent to every other researcher: if you publish data we don't like, we will ruin your career and your family. So researchers self-censor, they keep their heads down, and the public is left with ideologically filtered misinformation.
So if we pull all the way back and look at this entire landscape Soh has laid out, what is the ultimate takeaway here? What is the core message she's trying to get across to you, the person listening to this right now?
Her ultimate point is that biology is not bigotry. We are living in a moment where scientific truth is being vetted by political palatability, and Soh argues that is incredibly dangerous. She wants you to understand that acknowledging the biological differences between men and women doesn't make you sexist, and acknowledging the complex biology of gender, including concepts like autogynephilia, desistance, and the gamete binary, doesn't make you transphobic. She believes we must treat people with absolute compassion and respect, but we cannot do that by lying about basic human biology.
Which leaves us with Soph's final, lingering warning. If her data is right, and we are allowing ideology to fully overwrite biology in our textbooks, in our academic journals, and most terrifyingly, in our pediatric clinics, how do we ever fix the medical mistakes being made today when society decides to prioritize what it wants the truth to be over what the data actually says? Who ultimately ends up paying the price?